Brought to you by Lone Star Texas Grill, home of big, bold tastes and Texas-sized fun. Located on 251 Ontario Street.
Hello, I'm Sebastian Diaz for QTV Profiles, and today we have a special treat for you guys. Paul Gross, the director of Passchendaele, Men with Brooms, and the up-and-coming Hyena Road, which is set to release in, well, it hasn't even gone on camera.
I gotta shoot it first.
You gotta shoot it first, all right. But my first question is, we cater to a very young audience, and where we're all coming into the world, we're about to enter into the professional workforce, and I was kind of wondering, what was that like for you back in, I guess, would it be like the 80s when you were living in a house with a lot of creative people? What was it like existing with those guys and also coming up with your craft? And if any of the theories or discussions that you had carried over into your professional career that kind of incubated at such a young age?
Yeah, I think it did. You know, I think you're sort of referring to this one apartment building on Yorkville Avenue in Toronto, 11 Yorkville. And there were a ton of people living there. Jackie Burroughs and Stephen Ouimet and John Frizzell, among others. But it was also this sort of magnet for everybody a lot of people were involved in film. The origins of Rhombus and various other people would be floating in and out through this kind of, it seemed like a kind of 24-hour rolling party that would move to different apartments, but it was always on the go. And a big part of it was we sat around arguing about the relative merits of one film style versus another, or how you concentrate on narrative, or what should Canadian culture consist of, or what do we want to see in our theater, and how do we go about telling the stuff that we're interested in telling. And I mean, there was lots of very rarely was there any one solid idea that came out of that, or something that we all completely agreed to, but we exercised our brains about it. And I'd have to say that in part, I think it was really formative. If for no other reason than to begin with, it's the first time I really had those conversations, and realized that there were other people who were thinking the same things or similar things and willing to have those conversations. And somewhere out of there, I think, or in the course of it, I formulated, if not, you know, an approach necessarily, but a desire to see a certain kind of thing on the screens in our country and to be part of that. And yeah, so it was really important, I think, for all of us involved. It didn't last indefinitely because we would have all ended up in rehab, so it had to stop. But it was really a really key period in my life. And it crossed everything between television, film, and theater. We were all sort of, there was a big melange of, you know, narrative storytelling arts, I guess.
And my next question is involving your film Passchendaele, a big film about the Battle of Passchendaele, and among many other things, a lot of the narrative takes place in Canada. I was just wondering, how did you go about getting some of the battle sequences and some of the other scenes, like the very detailed establishing shots with carriages, and what was it like going through directing that type of stuff in Canada?
I mean, I think it would be the same, you know, directing it anywhere, but I mean, it was a pretty big film. It had big elements in it, and the elements that were involved in Calgary were kind of skinnied down from what we'd originally planned because we couldn't afford certain kinds of things. But it's always tricky, you know, when you've got a lot of pieces of things moving, a lot of moving parts and extras and cranes and carts and things. It takes quite a long time to you know, negotiate all that and block it. So it took a little while to shoot that. But there's a great enthusiasm about making films in Canada. We aren't jaded like they might be in New York or in California, and particularly in Alberta. We were shooting at Fort Macleod, which is quite a ways south from any film center. You know, people were showing up with their antique carts and their old cars. And
I had a lot of help from the community.
People who just arrived to help. I mean, there are lots of people we paid also, but it was really, it became kind of like almost like a community project. So it was really, that was fun. The battlefield stuff is an altogether different matter. That took, I think it was something close to 3 months to build. Wow. I mean, we had to take all of the topsoil off, and then we had to dig in holes. We had to put in dead trees. We had to soak it.
Lots of mud.
Lots of mud. Yeah, it took about 3 weeks of just watering it all to get it to hold the mud well enough. And it's a very complicated set to build, and shooting it was really unbelievably horrible. It was cold. The water all came out of the Elbow River. It was raining all the time. We had big irrigation pivots, and that water was sub-zero. So you'd just freeze. You'd lose your hands in about a half an hour. And It was tough work. But on the other hand, it did sort of replicate the conditions that the soldiers themselves went through at Passchendaele, so I thought there was some payoff in that. But I can tell you there's two words I never wish to hear again as long as I live, and it was the two words the AD would call. When I got all the cameras set, and I'd say, all right, Phil, call it. And the AD sort of gets everything rolling, all the cameras rolling and everything, but the first thing he would say is, rain up. And that's when the rain would start coming. And everyone on that set would start going, no, and it would go down your back.
And most of them, people are waist deep in this water. It must have been quite
we had to be very careful because people were getting, there were a couple guys the first days looked like they were getting close to frostbite. So we had to be careful with it. But it was, on the other hand, everybody involved in it no one ever quit. Everyone was so enthusiastic, and they'd stay late and they'd show up early, and you'd look around in that mud field and people falling down. They got beaming faces on, So we all felt that we were doing something that we individually had ownership in, and that we cared about, and it was a terrific spirit. In fact, probably one of the greatest experiences I've ever had around a camera. It was even in spite of sort of running around doing different jobs, but it was so much. We all felt a bit like we were on a mission of some kind, but it was a fun one. It was tremendous.
Beautiful. And your next film that's coming out, or about to go on camera, is a film called Hyena Road. And it's got a very interesting story in how you came about this project, how you went to Afghanistan, you took a lot of interviews with soldiers and footage. Could you tell a little bit more about how that film kind of came into fruition?
Sure. I mean, it did. Yeah, I did go to Afghanistan. I was asked actually around about the time we were doing Passchendaele, or leading up to it, maybe a couple of years before, to go to Afghanistan. Well, really, in a sense, when we were first there, but I couldn't because I was doing other things. And then, there was another time I was about to go, but then they called the trip off because things were getting a little too hot. In any event, I was finally able to go a couple of years ago, and the initial trip was just to support the troops kind of trip. But I was completely mesmerized by the war, being in a war zone, the complexity of it, the sheer amount of men and machinery and stuff. There's just stuff moving all the time, and these weird mysteries. You think, what's going on over there? What's that about? And I had some fantastic conversations with various soldiers with different specialties, and I thought, well, the least thing I should do is probably come back and try and film some of it. I wasn't thinking, I didn't have a story in mind, I didn't have a film in mind, but I thought I should photograph it because we were going to pull out of combat operations. So I went back with a camera team and we were there for a couple of weeks, and we shot about 60 hours of raw stuff of everything we could point a camera at. And then I sat around and talked to soldiers at night. And it's out of all of those conversations that I started to pull bits and pieces of things that I've assembled into the story that is Hyena Road. And I think I'm very excited about it because we're going to use all of that footage inside it, so it'll have this kind of amazingly tactile quality to it, I think. And the events in the story are those taken from real events from the soldiers' experiences. So I think it has a kind of, I don't like to call it kind of hyper-real, but it feels like that to me, and I'm calling it that because I don't know what else to call it. But it has this sort of hyper-real quality, but it's also really surprising because the events are not ones that you would traditionally, or I would naturally gravitate towards writing, because they're unexpected. And I think it should, I think it's going to be awesome.
I've read a little bit of it. There's a lot of acronyms. It reminded me of reading A Clockwork Orange for the first time, always going back to the glossary, trying to figure out what the rooks and Darug and all that stuff.
Well, I kind of thought about changing the acronyms, and I thought, actually, everyone will just get the gist of it. And if you don't know exactly what OPSEC means, you'll figure it out, and it doesn't really matter. My father, who was a tank commander in the Canadian Forces, had a great story about acronyms, and there was the U.S. military is one that really has acronyms, and during Vietnam they had to have an appendix to the battle manual, which was like that deep, filled with explanation of what the acronyms were. And some wag in the Defense Department had thrown in one called the FUCK, and it was the Forward Unaccompanied Combat Kitchen. I thought that was pretty good.
Maybe you can talk a little bit about acting in a movie that you are not directing, and then acting in a movie that you have a lot of command over the story.
Acting in something I'm not producing or directing is like a holiday. I love it. I don't have to think about anything. The light can be dropping. I don't care. It's not my problem. Someone else can worry about it. It really is actually quite it's great. But I also like being involved in, because I'm a bit, I don't know, maybe I'm a control freak, but I like being involved in all the aspects of doing stuff. And the only thing about acting and directing yourself in the middle of it, it's a bit strange. You sort of have to split yourself in half a little bit. And at first, when I did it, I was always worried about holding the setup, like everyone's waiting around for me to look at me. It felt too self-involved somehow, so I sort of shortchanged me. I mean, I wouldn't give myself close-ups or other takes. Yeah, that's good enough. But I'm getting a little bit better about that now. And I think it really depends. I wouldn't do it all the time. In Hyena Road, I feel like I know this particular character extremely well, and so I might as well do that, and we'll get. And he's not in every scene, so it's not the end of the world. But yeah, it's a funny, but you get used to it, you know. I mean, it's sort of multitasking, I suppose. The weirdest thing is when you're editing, because you have to divorce yourself from yourself, so you start referring to yourself in the third person, and it's usually really negatively. He's terrible in this scene. Why is he so terrible?
Oh wait, it's me.
Oh, wait. He's great.
And maybe just as a final thing, if you have any words of advice for young students about to go into the industry, film industry, any words of wisdom, per se?
No, absolutely, I have no words of wisdom. No, my advice is shoot, make movies. You know, you have the luxury of having equipment that you have access to that can allow you to make things in a way that we couldn't when I was coming in, and because we had to have actually film still. And I think the most important thing is to just keep doing it. And when you're leaving school, you get yourself involved in productions. If you really want to be in film and movies and television, you go and get on to shows that are shooting out of Toronto or Montreal or Newfoundland, or get in and around those kinds of things, so you start to really understand what the operation of a set is like. And at the same time, you write your own shows, you direct your own shows, and make them shorts. And once you start to get the feeling of making a complete narrative inside a short, then you start expanding that out. But yeah, make movies.
You heard it at QTV. Shoot, shoot, shoot. This has been QTV Profiles. I'm Sebastian Diaz, and this is Paul Gross.
Brought to you by Lone Star Texas Grill, home of big, bold tastes and Texas-sized fun, located on 251 Ontario Street.